The wind off the high plains carried the smell of pine resin and gunpowder. Luke Callahan pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of the ridge and squinted down into the valley. Smoke curled from a half-finished chimney, stubborn against the dying light. A woman was down there, chopping timber, her movements sharp and furious, as if she were punishing the earth itself. He'd seen her before. Every evening for nearly 2 weeks. Riding back from the canyons, Luke had caught sight of her figure against the setting sun. Alone, always working, never stopping. At first, he'd thought she was mad. A woman building a cabin by herself, this far out in Wyoming territory, with winter closing in and the nearest neighbor 10 miles away. Madness or desperation? Maybe both. The mare shifted under him, uneasy at the scent of the storm brewing beyond the ridge. Luke stroked the animal's neck absently, eyes fixed on the woman. She moved with a limp now. He hadn't noticed it before. Her hands were wrapped in torn cloth, and blood stained the edges. Still, she swung that axe like she meant to outlive the world. Luke knew something about working until you forgot how to feel. He'd done it himself for 3 years straight, ever since the fire that took his wife and boy, and half the ranch house along with them. He'd rebuilt the walls, restocked the herd, kept the books balanced, and the neighbors satisfied. But when night came and the silence pressed in, the house stayed empty no matter how much he repaired. That was why he watched her. Because in her struggle, he saw motion. Life, stubborn and defiant. A gust of wind tore through the valley, scattering sawdust and ash. She straightened suddenly, sensing she was being watched. Her head lifted toward the ridge, eyes narrowing against the dusk. For a heartbeat, their gazes met. 2 ghosts in living bodies, seeing the same kind of ruin reflected back. Luke turned his horse away, jaw tight. Whatever story she carried, it wasn't his concern. He'd spent too long chasing pain disguised as purpose. But as he rode off, thunder rolled low behind him, and he glanced back once more. She was dragging another log through the mud, refusing surrender even to the coming storm. Something about that broke him open in a place he didn't know was still tender. By the time he reached the river crossing, snow had begun to fall. Big, heavy flakes that swallowed sound. He could still see the faint plume of her fire through the whiteness, flickering, small, and alone. Then came the sharp crack of splintering wood. He stopped, listened. Another crash, followed by a shout, faint but human. Luke cursed under his breath, wheeled the horse around, and spurred back toward the valley. The storm hit full force as he rode, blinding snow driving sideways. By the time he reached the clearing, the half-built cabin had partially collapsed. One corner of the roof sagged inward, and the woman was pinned beneath a fallen beam, half buried in snow. He dismounted before the horse stopped moving, yanked his coat off, and went for the beam. She looked up, dazed, her eyes wild and terrified. "Don't touch me," she shouted. "Then you'll die here," Luke said flatly, bracing his shoulder under the timber. His boots slipped in the slush, muscles straining until the log shifted. "On 3, he grunted. "You push." The beam rolled free, and she crawled out. Gasping, the storm howled around them, tearing at their clothes. She stared at him through the snow, disbelief and defiance mixed. "Why'd you come back?" Luke looked past her at the ruined cabin. "Because some things," he said quietly, "ain't meant to fall apart alone." The wind screamed through the valley like a living thing. Luke shoved the cabin door shut behind them, his shoulder pressed hard against it until the latch caught. The interior was half ruined, roof sagging, one wall missing. But it was shelter enough to keep the snow from killing them outright. The woman sat on the dirt floor, cradling her arm. Blood soaked the sleeve of her shirt where the beam had caught her. Luke tore a strip from his coat lining and wrapped it around the wound, his hands rough but steady. "You'll need a doctor," he said. She flinched at his touch. No doctor's riding out here for me. Her voice was dry as the plains, and there was something in it that wasn't just pain. Something like resolve, hardened by too many disappointments. Luke tied the knot tight. You'll lose the arm if it festers. Wouldn't be the first thing I've lost, she muttered. They sat in silence for a long while, the storm gnawing at the cabin walls, snow whistling through the gaps. Luke fed the small fire in the corner, and the flames threw their shadows across her face. Pale, strong, too young to look that tired. Name's Luke Callahan, he said at last, just to fill the space. I didn't ask. He almost smiled. You're welcome anyway. She glanced at him, wary but curious. Nora Bell. Her eyes followed the flames like someone watching a past life burn down. Luke didn't press her with questions. He recognized the way people guarded their stories, how the truth could cut deeper than any wound. Still, he couldn't stop wondering what had driven her out here alone, trying to build a home on land that wanted her gone. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. My husband used to say a woman's place was wherever she was loved. Then one day, he found a bottle that loved him better. Luke didn't answer. He'd known men like that, seen what whiskey and failure could do when they set their teeth into a soul. He drank away the winter stores last year. Nora continued, eyes fixed on the fire. Sold the mule too. When the cold came, he said he was riding into town to find work. Her mouth trembled once, then steadied. They found his horse frozen by the creek. No sign of him. The room was quiet, except for the pop of the firewood. Luke looked at her hands, scarred, blistered, raw. You came out here after that? I came out here because the town took our house. Said a woman alone didn't own nothing without a man's signature. I had one thing left, this plot Ben staked before he died. So I figured I'd build it myself, one log at a time. Her voice cracked on the last words. She turned her face away, but he saw the tears glint in the firelight before she wiped them away with the back of her hand. Luke stirred the fire with a poker, jaw tight. The world's full of thieves with manners. That made her look at him. Really look, the way she had on the ridge before the storm. What about you, Mr. Callahan? What are you building? He let out a rough laugh that sounded more like pain. Nothing worth keeping. Outside, the wind howled again, louder now, pressing against the walls like an angry god. A plank rattled loose overhead, snow spilling through. Luke climbed up on a beam and nailed it back in place, but the effort reopened a scar along his wrist. A burn, old but deep. Nora noticed. How'd that happen? He hesitated. House fire. Yours? He nodded once. My wife and boy. I thought I could save 'em. Thought if I just worked harder, fixed the beams faster, they'd... He stopped, breath catching in his throat. It was the smoke that got him, not the fire, the smoke. Nora stared into the flames, her expression softening. And you? Didn't die? He said simply. Just stopped living. The storm went on for hours. They said little after that. Words had weight, and both of them had carried too much already. When the wind finally eased, the fire had burned low. Luke sat with his back to the wall, exhaustion dragging at him. Across from him, Nora had fallen asleep, her injured arm cradled against her chest, lips parted slightly. The flickering light turned her features gentle, almost peaceful, as if sleep had lifted her from the ruin of her life. Luke felt something stir in him, something dangerous, because it wasn't pity. It was recognition. Two broken things that somehow fit together. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the storm lull him toward a restless half-dream. In it, he saw his boy again, standing in the doorway of the old ranch house, holding out a wooden horse he'd carved. You said you'd come back, the child whispered. Then smoke rolled in like fog, swallowing everything. Luke woke with a start, heart hammering. The fire was out, the cold biting through his coat. Dawn bled faintly through the cracks in the wall. Nora was gone. He scrambled to his feet, kicked snow aside, and stepped out into the pale morning. The storm had passed, leaving the world silent and white. Then he saw her, 50 yards away, kneeling by the fallen beam, trying to lift it alone, her wounded arm trembling from the effort. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, rushing toward her. She looked up, eyes blazing with stubborn fire. "Finishing what I started." He stopped, chest tightening. The cold wind stung his face, but the words hit harder. There she was, half frozen, half broken, still fighting to stand in a world that had taken everything. And for the first time in years, Luke Callahan wanted to fight too. The sun clawed its way through the thinning clouds, revealing a world buried under 2 feet of snow. The storm had passed, but it had left more than ruin behind. It had drawn 2 broken souls into each other's orbit. Luke helped Nora brace the fallen beam and reassemble the cabin frame, his breath steaming in the morning air. Her arm throbbed beneath the rough bandage, but she refused to rest. Every nail she drove sounded like defiance. Every swing of the hammer was an answer to the world that kept trying to silence her. "You'll tear that arm clean off," Luke said, pulling the hammer gently from her hand. "Then I'll swing with the other one," Nora shot back. He almost smiled, but it died when he saw the shadows moving near the tree line. 3 riders. Luke's instincts sharpened. He stepped in front of her without thinking. The men rode closer, local ranch hands, the kind who worked for other people's greed. He recognized the lead one, Silas Crane, foreman for a cattle baron named Wardell, a man who'd been swallowing up every abandoned homestead between the ridge and the river. "Morning, Callahan," Silas called, voice dripping with mock politeness. "Didn't expect to see you keeping company with outlaws." Nora's eyes flashed. "I ain't no outlaw." Silas laughed, reining in his horse so close the animal's hooves sprayed snow across her boots. "You're squatting on Wardell land, sweetheart. Paperwork says so. You got 2 days to clear off." Luke's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." Silas shrugged. "Maybe. But a lie with ink on it gets real fast." He turned to Nora. "Ain't personal, ma'am. World just don't bend for widows with dreams." Luke stepped forward, voice low and dangerous. "You tell Wardell he's picked the wrong ghost to fight." The riders laughed, but there was unease behind it. They could see something in Luke's eyes, something that had already survived worse than them. Silas tipped his hat and rode off, calling over his shoulder, "2 days, Callahan. Then we come back with law and fire." When they disappeared into the distance, the silence returned, thick and cold. Nora exhaled shakily. "They can't do this, Ben. He staked this claim himself. Men like Wardell don't care who staked what. They care who's left to fight for it." Her jaw set. "Then I'll fight." Luke studied her, the stubborn line of her shoulders. She was smaller than she seemed when she worked, all bone and sinew and sheer willpower. But she stood like a soldier facing an army. "You can't do it alone," he said. "Neither can you," she shot back. He had no answer for that. That night, they worked by lamplight, hammering new boards over the gaps in the roof. Every strike echoed across the frozen valley like a challenge. When the wind shifted, Luke thought he heard a coyote howl. But the sound carried something human in it, something warning. By midnight, he saw the first flicker of orange on the horizon. "Fire," Nora said, voice trembling. "They're burning the woods." Luke ran outside, snow crunching under his boots. Down by the creek, flames licked up the dry brush. Not wildfire, but torches, moving in a line. The bastards had come back early. He grabbed his rifle from the saddle. "Get inside," he ordered. Nora hesitated. "You can't." "Inside now," He aimed toward the glow, firing once into the air. The sound cracked through the valley. The torchlight scattered, but only for a moment. Shots answered from the dark. The echo rolled like thunder. Luke dove behind a log pile. A bullet tore through his coat sleeve. Another hit the cabin wall, splintering wood inches from Nora's head. She screamed his name, but he didn't answer. "Luke!" He fired again, hitting one of the riders square in the shoulder. The man fell, his torch tumbling into the snow and hissing out. The others retreated, their laughter trailing off into the dark. Then silence, except for the pounding of Luke's pulse in his ears. He rose slowly, breath ragged. "You hurt?" Nora shook her head, shaking, gripping the doorframe. "They'll be back." "I know." She stared at him, fury and fear mixing in her eyes. "You should have let me go when you found me. You don't owe me this fight." "Maybe not," he said quietly, reloading his rifle. "But I owe myself one." Morning came gray and bitter. Smoke drifted low across the snow, the charred remains of the fire marking where the raiders had been. Luke rode out at first light, tracking their prints toward town. At the general store, folks fell silent when he walked in, as if tragedy had shape and name, and it was his. Wardle sat at the counter, signing papers with a lazy hand. Luke slammed his rifle down on the counter. "You sent your dogs to burn her out." Wardle looked up slowly, his smile smooth as oil. "You'll need proof, Mr. Callahan. Law's on my side." Luke's voice dropped to a growl. "Law ain't the same as right." Wardell's eyes hardened. "Careful. You've already lost one home, haven't you? Don't make it two." Luke stepped closer, their faces inches apart. "If you come near her again, I'll make sure you lose more than land." The store went dead quiet. Wardell didn't move, but his hand twitched toward his holster, a gesture Luke didn't miss. He turned and walked out before blood was spilled. For now. Back at the cabin, Nora waited by the fire. Her injured arm was worse, swollen and fevered. She tried to hide it, but he saw the pain in her eyes. "You should have gone to town," he said. She shook her head. "And let them see me weak? They'd eat me alive." He knelt beside her, pressing a cool cloth to her arm. "Then we'll make 'em choke on it instead." For the first time she smiled. Faint, tired, but real. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of hooves again. The fight wasn't over. The storm that had nearly killed them was just the beginning. Luke loaded his rifle and stared into the distance, where the mountains met the sky. This time, he wouldn't just survive the fire, he'd fight it. The snow melted slowly, revealing a land half-healed and half-wounded. Smoke no longer rose from the ridge, but the threat still lingered. The kind of quiet that follows men who mean to strike again. Luke stayed near the cabin those next days, repairing walls, hauling logs, and tending to Nora's injured arm. She hated needing help. He could see it in the way her jaw tightened whenever he reached for something before she could. But she didn't push him away either. The cabin had become their fragile truce, two people who'd learned too much about losing, trying to remember what it meant to belong. Each morning before dawn, he lit the fire. She'd wake to the smell of coffee and the rasp of him sharpening tools by the hearth. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours, but the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. One morning, as light spilled through the window, Luke found her standing by the unfinished window frame, watching the world thaw. Her hair was loose for the first time, falling in tangled waves over her shoulders. "You're staring again," she said softly, not turning. He smiled faintly. "Guess I am. You always do that. Like you're watching something disappear." He leaned against the post. "I've seen enough things vanish to know when something's worth remembering." She met his eyes then. Not with defiance this time, but with something gentler. Something that frightened her more than any gunman ever could. "Don't start saying pretty things to me, Luke Callahan," she murmured. "You'll ruin all the good silence we've built." He stepped closer, close enough that the air between them grew warm. Then maybe it's time the silence broke. But before the moment could fall into place, the faint jingle of spurs echoed outside. Luke's body went still. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. A knock, firm, deliberate. It was the sheriff. He stepped inside, hat in hand, eyes darting between them. "Wardell's filed formal charges," he said. "Claims you shot one of his men unprovoked. There'll be a hearing come Friday." Luke's grip on the rifle tightened. "He sent those men to burn her out." "I believe you," the sheriff said quietly. "But belief don't win against paper. Be ready." He nodded once and left. When the door closed, Luke turned to Nora. Her face was pale. "You'll lose everything," she whispered. "So will you," he said. "I've already lost everything once." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then I guess we're even." That night, they sat by the fire as wind brushed against the cabin walls. The tension between them was a living thing, not the kind that pushed people apart, but the kind that waited for courage to cross it. Nora stared into the flames. "You shouldn't have come back for me that night," she said. "You could have kept riding, saved yourself a whole lot of trouble." Luke leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And what would I've ridden toward? Another empty house, another grave to visit?" Her throat tightened. "You don't know what I've done, who I was before all this." He looked up at her, eyes steady. "Doesn't matter. I only care who you are now." She laughed quietly, a sound full of disbelief and exhaustion. "And who am I?" He stood and crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair. "You're the first thing that's made me feel alive in 3 years." The words were plain, almost careless in delivery. But they carried the weight of everything he'd never said to anyone since the fire. She blinked, her breath catching. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say that." He reached up, fingertips brushing her jaw. "Why?" "Because I might start believing you." "Then do." She froze, searching his face, as if waiting for the lie. When she didn't find one, her resistance broke. She leaned forward, closing the last inch between them. The kiss was soft, tentative, almost startled, like both were remembering how to live in that single heartbeat. Outside, the moonlight turned the snow silver. Inside, 2 people who'd spent years in grief finally found warmth that wasn't born of fire. By morning, the world looked different. The thaw was nearly complete, and the cabin stood solid against the horizon, finished enough to feel like a promise. Nora was already outside, hammering new boards into place. Luke watched her from the doorway, the wind tugging at her hair, her sleeves rolled up, sunlight tracing the faint curve of a smile she didn't know she wore. He stepped down, took the hammer from her, and replaced it with a cup of coffee. "Bossing me around again?" she teased. "Keeping you alive." "Same thing." Their laughter blended with the rustle of spring wind. Awkward, quiet, but real. 2 days later, word spread across the valley. Wardell's men were gathering near town. The hearing was a trap. Everyone knew it. Wardell had bought the judge, the witnesses, the land office clerk. He wanted the cabin burned again, this time under the pretense of law. Luke saddled his horse in silence. Nora followed him to the gate, her hands trembling slightly. "If you go, they'll tear you apart," she said. He met her eyes. "If I don't, they'll take your land." "Then let 'em," she whispered. "I'm tired of fighting." He reached for her hand. "I'm not fighting for the land, Nora. I'm fighting for you." Her eyes filled before she could look away. She turned, pressing her forehead against his chest, her fingers clutching the front of his coat. "I don't know how to love without losing, Luke. I don't want to bury another person I care about." He lifted her chin gently. "Then stop thinking about burying and start thinking about living." They stood like that for a long time. 2 scarred lives bound together by something too new to name and too fragile to deny. He kissed her again, slower this time, certain. "When this is over," he said against her lips, "we build something better. Together, promise, one log at a time." He rode away as the sun rose, leaving her standing by the cabin door, watching him disappear into the valley, the same way he'd once watched her from a ridge. But this time, she wasn't alone. The story had changed. Love wasn't the soft thing she remembered from before. It was the hard thing that survived storms, bullets, and loss. It was what remained when everything else had been burned away. The morning of the hearing came with a red sunrise, the kind that painted the Wyoming sky like a warning. Luke Callahan rode into town alone, the brim of his hat low, the weight of the rifle across his back a familiar comfort. Dust swirled around his horse's hooves, and every eye in Clearwater turned toward him as he passed. The saloon was crowded. Half the town had gathered to see what would become of the widow and the man who'd chosen to stand beside her. On the makeshift platform sat Judge Hollis, round and self-important, and beside him, Wardell, dressed like he owned the earth beneath his boots. Luke tied his horse outside and walked through the crowd. Conversations hushed to murmurs. "Mr. Callahan," Judge Hollis began, voice oily and loud, "you stand accused of assault, trespass, and unlawful possession of property not your own. How do you plead?" Luke's voice was steady. "I plead for the truth, Judge. That's all." Wardell smirked, leaning back. "Truth's a mighty flexible thing, son." Luke turned toward the crowd, toward the blacksmith, the general store clerk, the women who whispered behind gloves and curtains. "You all know me," he said, voice rising. "You know what I lost? My wife, my boy. I spent years building fences around ghosts. But that woman out on Willow Creek, she reminded me what it means to live." A murmur rippled through the room. Wardell's smirk faltered. "She built that cabin with her own hands," Luke continued. "Not to steal, not to provoke, but to survive. And men like Wardell here can't stand the sight of someone poor and honest doing what they can without his permission." Wardell stood abruptly, slamming a fist on the table. "You'll watch your mouth, Callahan. I'd rather you watch your conscience," Luke shot back. Gasps. The tension cracked like thunder. Hollis banged the gavel, shouting for order. But Wardell wasn't listening. He turned to his men, 4 of them, lurking near the back. Hands drifted to holsters. Luke saw it coming before anyone else did. His hand moved, not fast, not desperate, just sure. When Wardell drew, Luke's rifle was already leveled. The shot echoed like judgment itself. Wardell's gun flew from his hand, hitting the floor with a metallic clatter. The bullet had missed his heart by mercy's breadth, a deliberate wound. Silence swallowed the room. "The next one," Luke said evenly, "goes through." Hollis froze, trembling. Mr. Callahan, this ain't how law works." "No," Luke said quietly, lowering the rifle. "This is how justice does." He reached into his coat pocket and dropped a bundle of papers onto the judge's table. Ben Bell's original land deed, signed and dated, with Wardell's forged claim stapled behind it. "Found this in the clerk's office? Guess some lies travel faster than others." Hollis turned pale. "Where did you—" "Doesn't matter. You've got your proof." From the doorway, a voice broke through the shock. "And you've got your witnesses." It was Nora. She stood in the threshold, wrapped in her old coat, face pale but fierce. Behind her, several townsfolk followed. Mabel the storekeeper, the blacksmith, and even Sheriff Oates himself. They'd come not to watch, but to stand beside her. "The cabin's ours," Nora said. "The work was ours, the land was ours, and no paper written by a thief changes that." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind pushing through the door. Then the sheriff cleared his throat. "I reckon that's enough talking, Judge. Time we let right stand on its own." He turned to Wardle. "You and your men, get out of my town." Wardle's glare burned with hatred, but there was no victory left in him. He clutched his wounded arm, muttered something ugly, and stalked out. Luke watched him go, then exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. When the crowd began to disperse, Nora crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from him. "You came back," she said softly. "Wasn't gonna let 'em burn you out." Her voice trembled. "They almost burned you instead." He smiled faintly. "Would have been worth it." And then, finally, she let herself fall into his arms. The weight of months, years, pain, guilt, all of it fell away. He held her like a man who'd forgotten what holding meant. Outside, the town went on breathing. For the first time in a long time, it felt like a place that could forgive itself. The spring thaw came fast after that. Snow gave way to mud, and mud to wildflowers. The cabin at Willow Creek stood strong again, roof complete, smoke rising lazy from the chimney. One evening, Luke sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar while Nora tended the small garden she'd planted. The scent of rain drifted through the valley. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. He looked up. "Next?" She smiled faintly. "When all the fighting's done," he shrugged. "Guess I'll still be here, hammering wood, keeping the roof steady." She tilted her head. "That a proposal, Callahan?" He grinned. "Maybe it is." And she laughed, really laughed, full and alive, like someone who'd finally outrun the ghosts that chased her. When night fell, the stars returned, scattered and bright. They sat side by side, hands entwined, the silence between them now warm and earned. The cabin creaked softly in the wind. A house no longer made from survival, but from faith. Months passed. Luke and Nora's names faded from town gossip and grew into something steadier. Respect. Folks stopped whispering when they walked into church. Even the children waved when they rode past on the trail. Their cabin became more than shelter. It became a symbol. People who'd lost things, homes, family, faith, came by to help, to rebuild, to learn that starting over wasn't weakness. Moses, Luke's old foreman, said it best one afternoon while handing Nora a beam. "Funny thing about cabins," he said. "You think you're building them out of timber, but really you're building them out of people." Nora smiled at that. "Then I reckon we built ours strong." Luke looked at her, his eyes soft. "Stronger than I ever was alone." As spring rolled into summer, the valley bloomed. Not with perfection, but with peace. And peace, they'd learned, wasn't the absence of storms. It was learning how to build after them. Luke had once thought love died with loss. Nora had once believed kindness was just another trap. But they'd learned that hope, real hope, was a labor, not a miracle. It had to be built, one act of courage, one piece of trust, one log at a time. And when the wind rose again across Willow Creek, it didn't sound like grief anymore. It sounded like life. You can't rebuild the past, but you can build something honest from its ashes. Love isn't born from ease or luck. It's built the hard way, with patience, forgiveness, and hands that refuse to stop working. Sometimes, the truest homes aren't made of walls at all, but of people who choose to stay, even after the storms.